Hello everybody, welcome back to Glaciers and Glacial Geomorphology. We're at the beginning of step 9 and this week we're going to be talking about glacier hydrology and glacial geomorphology. But I wanted to begin by just refreshing your memories about where we are in the structure of the course and encouraging you to think about this big conceptual map of how everything hangs together, which I'm encouraging you to make as we go through the module, because it will probably crop up in the end of module workbook assessment. Certainly that assessment will ask you to tie together different components from different sections of the module. So let's just think back over the way I've been describing this conceptual map to you. We began by talking about the big global system. We talked, for example, about the hydrological cycle. We also talked, as well as talking at the grand scale, we talked at the micro scale, and we threw in a little bit about stable isotopes at that stage as well, just to make this point that we're thinking at a global scale, we're thinking at a local scale, and we're thinking at a micro scale. And talking about the big global system led us through to thinking at a more kind of glaciological scale about mass balance, the formation of glaciers, the transformation of snow into ice, and partly because of that we were talking about the properties of glacier ice. That led us on to talking about the structure or anatomy of glaciers, from which we started talking about the morphology or the shape. We talked about the stratigraphy, we talked about the basal ice layer, we also talked about the overall gross morphology, and we talked about how the gross morphology, the shape of an ice sheet or a glacier, also relates very closely to motion or movement. And motion or movement is where we found ourselves arriving, having talked about the big global system, mass balance, transformation of snow to ice, the formation of glaciers, the properties of glaciers. Well, one of their key properties is motion, and that relates to the morphology. We were talking very much about this dynamics morphology link when we were talking about stress-strain relationships, Glenn's flow law, the shear stress equation. There was a lot of detail in there that we were talking about. Now, when talking about motion, a number of different topics cropped up as being really important. And one of those was temperature, and in particular we talked about the basal thermal regime. And we made the point that the basal thermal regime led to a geography of basal processes. And this is going to be really important for what we're moving on to talk about next, because as we've been working our way through the course, as you know, where we've been heading to is talking about geomorphology and landscapes. And so this geography of basal processes, the geography of what happens where underneath the glacier, at the interface between the glacier and the substrate, well, that is very much going to be leading us into, well, that's one of the big controlling factors behind glacial geomorphology and the geography of glacial landscapes. Another factor that cropped up at this level, when thinking about, well, what's controlling motion, we were thinking about hydrology, or water in glaciers. We said a little bit about temperature last time. The thing we haven't really said much about through all of this so far is hydrology, so I'm going to talk about that this week in step 9, and then we'll be ready to move on through with hydrology feeding towards geomorphology and also motion feeding towards geomorphology, as well as being connected to motion. We kind of now have our big picture beginning to emerge of what's, you can also think about whether there are some arrows up here that we need to be filling in as we move forward, but we're now beginning to get our big picture from the big global system through the characteristics and properties of glaciers down towards glacial geomorphology. Now we've added in lots of these details, basal ice layer, stable isotopes, temperature profiles, hydrology, all this stuff. Hopefully you're now feeling a little bit confident that you're understanding. For example, if I was to ask you, what are the major controls within a glacier system that determine the characteristics of glacial geomorphology, you would now be able to pull out a lot of those items. So we've already covered a huge amount, and if you go back and try to add details into here, for example, what you remember about the stratigraphy of a glacier and the basal ice layer, what you remember about the deforming layer as a mechanism for motion, or what you remember about the relationship between Glen's flow law and motion in terms of the properties of ice and the driving forces and the resisting forces and everything else, you now know, after 8 weeks of working through this module, you know an enormous amount. And this is probably a good moment to pause and think back to the CAM 1987 game that we started playing right in the first week of the module. Don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do remember that, where I gave you a copy of the abstract and the opening pages from CAM's 1987 paper, Barclay CAM's paper, Glacier Surge Mechanism based on linked cavity configuration of the basal water conduit system. And I showed it to you right at the beginning of the module in week 1, really just to make the point that there's a lot of complicated glaciological work out there that at that stage you were completely unfamiliar with, and I was guessing you probably wouldn't really get much of an idea of what it was all about. Even by looking at the abstract, I was imagining that you would pretty quickly find yourself reading things that you didn't know anything about. And even that very first line, based on observations of the 1982-83 surge of variegated Glacier Alaska, hang on, what's a surge? We didn't know what a surge was then. Variegated Glacier Alaska, what's that? You've never heard of that. Whereas now you know what a surge is, you know some of the complexities, you've seen some of the recent work, you know that surging is a really interesting and important topic in this area of our module. You know about the variegated glacier, we've compared the variegated with other glaciers that have different characteristics, remember rigid bed, soft bed, etc. You're familiar with surging, with the variegated glacier. And they say there a model of the surge mechanism is developed in terms of a transition from the normal tunnel configuration of the basal water conduit system to a linked cavity configuration that tends to restrict the flow of water, resulting in increased basal water pressures that cause rapid basal sliding. Okay, well you understand a lot of that as well now. You understand what rapid basal sliding is all about. You know the driving forces, the resisting stresses, and you know that, yeah, high basal water pressure is going to encourage rapid sliding. You know that. You also know that in a soft bed situation, high basal water pressure would also encourage rapid movement because you understand what's happening in terms of subglacial deformation of the subglacial layer as another mechanism of glacier motion. Now I rattled through the middle of that sentence about the normal tunnel configuration of the basal water conduit system and the linked cavity configuration. Now my guess is that at this stage, even if you haven't read up on that, you kind of know what that's talking about. You understand that there's water in glaciers, you understand that it can flow in a film, in a layer, it can exist in cavities, it can exist in passageways or tunnels, you know that. We haven't talked about it in detail, and that's kind of where we are this week. We're going to just refresh and update and upgrade our understanding of glacier hydrology, at which point the whole of this will be making sense to you. So it's an important thing to do as we work through the module. Remember things that you've encountered previously, like CAM 1987, this old paper, and think, well, I didn't understand that before, but now I've done this and that and the other. It's all beginning to come together. And by the time we get to the end of the module, all of these different things should be tying together and enabling you to get the most out of these classic papers and also out of the more modern research that you're reading, so that you're tying together the different parts of the system and understanding the connections between the big global picture, the geomorphology, the details of glacier structure and morphology, the specific details of how stable isotopes are telling us something about the hydrology or the formation of the basal ice, or how the mass balance is working, and how hydrology is connected both to the dynamics and to the geomorphology, partly through this controlling factor of basal thermal regime. It's all tying together, and 8 weeks ago it all seemed really complicated and some of the individual papers seemed really difficult, but hopefully now, week 9, just reflect on where you've been, what you've learned, make sure your notes are all in order, and just begin to check that you're seeing the connections. And we are now at this stage of just beginning to move on. We're transitioning, if you like, from this section of the module which has been all about the characteristics of glaciers and the behaviour of glaciers, and we're now moving into the section of the module which is about the impacts of those characteristics and the impacts of that behaviour on landforms, and that's going to be our final section of the module before we can tie everything together and connect this whole package into one clear and connected set of ideas. So that's what we're doing right now. We're talking about hydrology to finish off this section on glacier characteristics, and then we're going to start talking about geomorphology. I'll introduce that this week. Next week we'll be talking about glacial erosion and erosional landforms. The following week we'll be talking about glacial deposition and depositional landforms, and that will be bringing us towards the end of the module, where we'll tie everything together the week after that. Okay, good luck.